I hate you. She said it loud enough that the words bounced off the brass mailboxes and the marble floor of the lobby. I had one foot inside the elevator and one foot still out when I turned. Rain streaked down the tall front windows of the building behind her, and the whole evening rush of downtown Seattle seemed to hesitate for half a second just to watch me get hit with that sentence in public. She stood there holding a soaked welcome folder against her chest. The folder had split at the corners from the rain. Colored tabs stuck out from the top. A silver clip pinned a notice to the front like it was some kind of trophy. Her dark hair was damp around the edges, and her face had that tight, furious look people get when they've run out of patience long before they ran out of reasons. Sienna Vale, I said. That only made her angrier. So you do know who I am. She took 3 fast steps toward me. Good. Then you know exactly what you did. I glanced at the notice. Building Operations Review. Immediate suspension of instructional use pending compliance confirmation. My name wasn't on it. My firm wasn't on it either. But I recognized the language. It had been pulled from one of my recent risk summaries for the new asset director upstairs. I didn't issue that, I said. You handed them the excuse. Her voice dropped, somehow sharper for it. They've wanted my space for months, and then your review lands on somebody's desk, and suddenly I'm the problem tenant. Around us, people kept moving, but slower now. A courier in a wet bike jacket pretended to check his phone. 2 office workers near the door were openly listening. I stepped out of the elevator and let the doors close behind me. Show me the full notice. She gave a short, humorless laugh. That's it. No apology, no speech, no fake concern. I don't do speeches in lobbies. I held out my hand. Let me see it. For a second I thought she might tear it in half instead. Then she shoved the folder at me. The first thing I noticed was the timing. The second was the citation line. By the 3rd paragraph, I already knew something was off. The notice claimed the school had triggered a technical occupancy issue connected to a facilities rider. It referenced insurer-backed inspection authority, but the procedural sequence was wrong. The review window was too short. The escalation language came before the cure language. Whoever drafted it wanted pressure, not process. When did you get this? 10 minutes ago. In front of parents. She folded her arms, but it looked more like she was holding herself together than trying to look tough. First fall intake week. New students. New families. My front desk person was trying to hand out schedules while a building rep clipped that thing to our packet like a parking ticket. I flipped to the next page. Where's your lease? In my office. Operating records? Her eyes narrowed. Why? Because if they're using my work as cover, I want proof. I handed the folder back. Your lease. The last insurance update. Compliance paperwork. Any rider they made you sign in the last year. She stared at me, rainwater still darkening the shoulders of her coat. You expect me to trust you after this? No, I said. I expect you to decide whether you want to stay angry or stay open. That landed. Not well, but clearly. A muscle moved in her jaw. Then she turned without another word and headed toward the glass doors leading into the ground floor corridor. Her music school sat just past the lobby, behind frosted panes with gold lettering that read Vale Music House. I followed her in. The place was nearly empty. The last student must have left in a hurry. One practice room door stood half open, a violin on a chair inside. In another room, sheet music still sat on a stand under a warm lamp. The silence in a place built for sound always feels unnatural. It felt worse with that notice in my hand. Sienna dropped the ruined folder on the front desk and led me to a small office behind the reception area. Stacks of recital programs, tuition envelopes, and supply invoices covered every flat surface. She pulled open a drawer, took out a thick lease file, then another folder, then another. Take it, she said. And when you find out I'm finished, at least say it fast. I sat, opened the first file, and started building a timeline. Lease. Amendments. Insurance correspondence. Building memos. Renewal packet. A rushed facilities update from 8 months ago. There. A rider buried behind 2 routine acknowledgement pages. Dry language. Easy to miss. Easy to slide through during a busy week. One clause added landlord-approved specialist findings as a controlling standard in certain cases, even when normal city guidance hadn't changed. I looked up at her. You didn't get shut down because of a real safety issue, I said. Her face went still. Then why? I tapped the page. Because somebody inserted a technical clause into your insurance update and waited for the right moment to use it. For the first time since she stopped me in the lobby, Sienna didn't look angry. She looked afraid. By 11 that night, the school looked less like a business and more like the scene of a careful disaster. Every flat surface had disappeared under paper. Contracts covered the tops of upright pianos. Maintenance logs were spread across a bench in Studio B. In the small recital room, donor letters sat in neat stacks beside old programs and permit renewals. All of it lit by the soft yellow lamp Sienna kept turning on one by one, as if refusing to let the place feel abandoned. Neither of us talked much. That was probably for the best. I worked the way I always worked, sorting by date, source, signature, then discrepancy. She worked by memory and instinct, moving fast until something familiar caught her eye, then doubling back with a kind of frustrated precision that told me she was used to carrying too much at once. She knew where everything came from. She just hadn't had the luxury of looking at it like evidence. At some point, she dropped a folder onto the piano beside me. "That was recital week," she said. "If you're about to tell me I should have read every page more carefully, save it." I wasn't going to. She folded her arms. "You were thinking it." I was thinking somebody knew exactly when to hand it to you. That changed her expression a little. Not softer, just less ready to fight. I opened the renewal packet she'd found. Standard cover memo. Insurance acknowledgement. Facilities update. Emergency contact verification. Then the writer I'd already flagged. Except this time I kept going past the clause and read the surrounding language line by line. That was where the shape of it became clear. "They hid it inside modernization standards," I said. Sienna looked up from a stack of vendor invoices. Meaning it wasn't presented as enforcement. It was presented as improvement. I turned the packet so she could see the paragraph. "This section allows building-approved specialists to issue findings that override normal guidance if the property claims enhanced operational risk." She stared at the page. In English, they created their own referee. Her mouth tightened, and I signed it. "You signed 50 pages during a week when you were probably doing 6 jobs at once." She looked away at that, toward the dark glass of the practice room window. "My mother used to handle this part." After she passed, I kept telling myself I was caught up. I wasn't. The way she said it told me that sentence had been waiting for a long time. I went back through the packet and found the inspection reference number. Then I matched it to the shutdown notice. Same chain, same formatting, same consultant signature. "Who is this?" Sienna asked as I copied down the company name. "Supposedly the specialist who flagged your space." Supposedly? The wording's too polished. Real independent reports usually read uglier than this. I pulled another sheet closer. "And this billing code doesn't match the service category." She came around the bench and stood beside me. Not close enough to be familiar, close enough to see. "So they hired someone to find a problem?" "I think they hired someone to write one." For the first time that night, she sat down. A few minutes later, Maya came in from the front desk, carrying takeout coffee in a cardboard tray and the tired, alert expression of someone who had decided she was staying whether she was asked to or not. She was younger than Sienna, sharp-eyed, still wearing her school hoodie over work clothes. "I called the parents from tomorrow's beginner group," she said. "Told them we might shift rooms." Then she saw the paper spread and looked at me. "You're the analyst." "That's Ryan." "I know who he is," she said. "You're the one from upstairs." There wasn't any warmth in it. Maya set the drinks down and started pulling invoice boxes from under the reception desk. "You should know this isn't just us," she said. "The costume studio on 4 got hit with fire access nonsense in spring. Then the print shop had a storage issue. Then the bookstore got buried in ventilation complaints. Same pattern every time. Vague notice, short deadline, pressure to leave." I looked up. Did any of them fight it? Not really. They were exhausted before they started. That fit too well. I moved from contracts to payment records, tracing vendor names, review fees, processing charges. One consulting firm kept appearing in tiny, forgettable amounts, never high enough to attract attention, always attached to administrative language broad enough to disappear into overhead. No real office address. No usable contact line. Paper existence. I wrote the name down twice. Sienna watched me do it. "That's bad." "It's designed not to look bad," I said, which usually means it is. Midnight slipped past. Rain ticked softly against the front windows. Somewhere deeper in the school, an old radiator clicked on and off. The place felt suspended, like it was waiting to hear its own future. I leaned back, looked at the spread of files, then at the list I'd built. Inspection writer. Controlled specialist. Repeating pressure tactics. Phantom consultant. This wasn't a lease dispute. It was a clearing operation. I met Sienna's eyes across the piano. Your school isn't the first target. She didn't answer right away. Then she asked, very quietly, how many? I don't know yet. I tapped the consulting name. But I know this much. Someone's pushing legacy tenants out before something bigger closes. Maya swore under her breath. Sienna stayed still, one hand resting on the edge of the piano like she needed the balance. Why us? I looked toward the front windows, where her gold lettering reflected faintly in the glass. Because spaces like this, I said, are always worth more to people who don't care what they are. The next morning, Gavin Holt called me at 8:12. Not a text, not an email through the firm. A direct call to my private number, which told me two things before he even spoke. First, he had gone looking for it. Second, he wanted me to notice that. Ryan. His voice was smooth in that practiced way people use when they want to sound relaxed while measuring your reaction. Hope I didn't catch you at a bad time. I was in my apartment kitchen with black coffee, yesterday's notes, and exactly 4 hours of sleep behind my eyes. Outside, Seattle looked washed gray again, low clouds hanging over the buildings like the city had decided not to wake up properly. You did, I said. What do you need? A small pause. He hadn't expected bluntness this early. I wanted to thank you for the speed of your initial review, he said. Very helpful work. We may wrap your assignment ahead of schedule. That was corporate language for stop digging. I leaned against the counter and looked at the legal pad I'd filled overnight at Sienna's school. Consultant shell. Repeating enforcement pattern. Tenant turnover aligned with redevelopment chatter. Then you probably don't need me, I said. Another pause. Softer this time. We like people who understand scope, Gavin said. There may also be a discretionary bonus involved for efficient closeout. Clean conclusions are valuable. There it was. Warning disguised as praise. I let the silence stretch until he filled it himself. Enjoy your day, Ryan. The line clicked dead. I stood there for a second with the phone still in my hand. My coffee had gone cold enough to drink fast, so I did. Then I opened my laptop and kept going. If Gavin was calling me directly, I was already on the edge of whatever this was. By 10, I was in a public records room downtown, moving through vendor registrations, licensing archives, and permit histories with the kind of patience most people mistake for calm. Calm had nothing to do with it. Pattern did. The inspection company that had flagged Sienna's school existed, technically. Registered. Tax ID. Business filings. But its footprint was wrong. Too thin in the places that should have been thick. Too polished where real operational history usually leaves a mess. Then I found the umbrella. A parent LLC with a forgettable name and a mailing address shared by 3 other entities that did almost nothing except move small amounts of money in circles. One branch handled specialized facility review. Another handled compliance support. A third billed reserve accounts tied to building operations. I mapped the names, then the signatures, then the addresses. One director had prior ties to a commercial advisory group that had consulted on 2 redevelopment projects Gavin had touched 5 years earlier. Not proof, but not coincidence either. Around noon, Sienna texted me. Any reason I just saw 2 men in suits talking to the front desk and pretending not to look at the school? I called instead of replying. She picked up on the first ring. Tell me that's normal. It isn't. Her exhale came sharp through the speaker. Great. Did they say who they were? No. Asked whether classes were running. Asked whether we'd scheduled an independent electrician. Asked whether I planned to contest the notice. I wrote that down. And you told them? That I don't discuss school operations with strangers who can't introduce themselves. Despite everything, I almost smiled. Good. A beat of silence. Then, quieter. Ryan, how bad is this getting? I looked through the glass wall of the records office at the wet street below. People crossing with umbrellas. Delivery trucks hissing at the curb. A normal day outside a very abnormal file trail. Bad enough that Gavin called me this morning and offered a polished version of hush money. She didn't answer for a second. When she did, the anger was gone from her voice. You kept going anyway. Yes. Another silence. Different this time. Not hostile. Measured. Why? She asked. I slid one permit copy over another and found the filing date I'd been looking for. Investor outreach discussions had begun just before the first tenant complaint started. Lower floor conversion language appeared 3 months later. Luxury retail experiences. Curated food concepts. Premium activation zones. Expensive words for replacing people with brands. Because the timeline is dirty, I said. The compliance issue only appears after investor talk starts. Before that, nothing. After that, your floor becomes a problem. I heard movement on her end, probably her office chair, maybe the door closing. So it is the school. It's the square footage, I said. The school just happens to be standing on it. She was quiet long enough that I knew the sentence had landed where it hurt. When I left the records office, I drove by the building but didn't go in. Too visible. Instead, I parked half a block away and worked from the car, pulling secondary vendor records tied to reserve account disbursements. 3 payment chains later, the same names surfaced again, hidden behind abbreviations and processing codes. One of them linked back to the inspection company. One linked to a consulting address near Bellevue that turned out to be a mail drop. And one, buried deepest, connected to an executive services firm whose managing contact had attended industry events with Gavin Holt. By 6, I had enough to know the chain was compromised. Not enough to win. Enough to be dangerous. Sienna let me into the school after closing. The halls were dim, the last of the day's piano notes long gone. The whole place carrying that after-hours stillness I was starting to associate with her. I set my folder on the office desk and spread out copies. This is the inspection trail, I said. It's not independent. It loops back through entities that connect toward Gavin. Her eyes moved over the papers, then lifted to mine. Toward, I'm careful with words when they can cost me. And if you stop being careful? I met her gaze. My firm may cut me loose. She looked at the documents again, then at the dark window in her office door where the empty hallway reflected back at us. For me? No, I said. For pushing this far. But even as I said it, we both knew that wasn't the whole truth. Sienna rested her hand on the edge of the desk, steady this time, not shaking. Then don't lie to me, Ryan. Not now. I looked down at the evidence between us, then back at her. If I keep going, I said, I'm not just helping you save a lease. I'm stepping across a line my firm would rather I stay behind. She held my eyes. And for the first time since she stopped me in that lobby, she didn't look at me like the man who started this. She looked at me like the man who might not be able to walk away. Over the next 2 days, Sienna and I stopped treating the school like the center of the problem. It was only one room in a larger fire. We started with the tenants still left in the building, the ones who kept their doors half open and their voices low, like they'd already learned that any complaint could somehow be used against them later. A costume repair studio on 4. A narrow specialty bookstore on 2 with warped oak shelves and handwritten staff notes tucked into the spines. A family print shop in the rear annex that smelled like paper dust and solvent and old machinery. Different businesses. Same fatigue. I handled the questions. Sienna handled the introductions. That mattered more than I expected. People opened the door for her because she belonged there. They answered me because I sounded like I already knew when they were being careful. At the costume studio, the owner showed us a binder full of notices tied to access corridor nonconformity. It sounded serious until I saw the photos attached. A rolling rack. 2 storage bins. Nothing that justified the speed of the pressure campaign that followed. At the bookstore, the ventilation issue turned out to be based on a consultant visit nobody had requested and nobody could verify independently. The owner, a man named Leon with tired eyes and a formal way of speaking, told us they'd been given a choice that wasn't really a choice. Accept a fast exit payment or face a review process expensive enough to break them anyway. The print shop was worse. The family who ran it had already moved most of their equipment out. The father met us in the stripped front room, hands stained with ink that looked permanent. He didn't waste time being polite. They wanted us cheap, he said. That's all this ever was. He went into the back and returned with a settlement packet. Quick payout. Tight deadline. Silence language dense enough to need its own lawyer. He hadn't signed the last page, but by then it hardly mattered. They were gone in everything except paperwork. I took photos, dates, signatures, routing numbers. Every excuse had a different label: fire access, documentation error, storage code, airflow concern, but the timing lined up too cleanly. Pressure appeared. Value dropped. Exit terms followed. One after another, legacy tenants got pushed into distress, and distress got turned into leverage. That night, I spread everything across Sienna's office floor and built a map. Leases, notices, settlement dates, vacancy shifts, reserve account movements, redevelopment milestones. I drew lines until the pattern stopped pretending it was random. Gavin wasn't just clearing tenants. He was depressing occupancy conditions on purpose. A building with instability on paper could be valued, financed, and restructured differently than a building with stubborn long-term community tenants who knew their rights. Create the appearance of friction, lower the real operating strength, push people out quietly, then step into the discount with a polished future already prepared. I stared at the numbers for a long minute before Sienna came in carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've got that look again," she said. "What look?" "The one where you found something I'm not going to enjoy hearing." I took the cup from her. "The vacancy pressure isn't a side effect. It's the strategy." She didn't sit right away. Meaning Gavin benefits if the building looks weaker before the deal closes. I pointed to the timeline. Reduced tenant stability. Short-term distress. Faster concessions. It changes the purchase structure. She set her coffee down slowly. "So he breaks the building first. He bruises it just enough for someone else to call it underperforming." Her eyes moved over the pages. She was learning to read evidence now, not just react to it. That change in her was happening fast. The next morning she taught 3 classes, handled worried parents, calmed 2 instructors, and somehow still found time to answer my calls between lessons. Watching her keep the school moving while preparing for possible closure did more to explain her than anything she'd said about herself. This place wasn't just income. It was schedules held together by trust. Scholarship kids who couldn't afford another program. Older teachers who'd built their week around these rooms. Community ensembles that had nowhere else to rehearse without being priced out of the city entirely. Lose the school, and a lot more than rent would disappear. By Thursday, I was working so often out of her office that I knew which desk drawer stuck unless you lifted it slightly. I knew the hum of the old lamp by the filing cabinet. I knew she kept recital ribbons in a biscuit tin and emergency cash in a Mark Theory workbook no student ever touched. None of it felt intimate in the usual way. It felt like trust earned through repetition. We were careful with each other. Maybe too careful. Long hours, close rooms, tired voices, no wasted words. The kind of restraint that says more than a confession would. Late that evening, Maya appeared at the office door with dust on her sleeves and a metal key in her hand. "You two need to come see this." She led us down a back corridor near the rehearsal wing, past stacked chairs and retired music stands, to a narrow storage room I'd assumed was dead space. She'd opened an old supply cabinet built into the wall. Inside were paper ledgers, correspondence files, and document boxes so old the labels had browned at the edges. "My guess," Maya said, "is nobody looked in here because nobody under 50 knew this thing opened." Sienna crouched beside the lowest shelf and pulled out a ledger with her mother's handwriting on the spine. For the first time all week, her composure broke. Not dramatically, just a pause. A hand held still too long over the cover. I took the next box and started sorting. Old rent records, tenant association notes, building circulars, and then, buried between operating statements and community event flyers, a packet of correspondence on thick letterhead from years before the current ownership group. Protected tenancy language, original arts occupants, cultural use continuity, renewal preference, stabilized terms tied to the building's historic identity. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't forcing the meaning. Then I looked at Sienna. "Your mother kept everything," I said. She nodded once, eyes still on the page. She never trusted polished people. I held up the letter. "Good instinct." Sienna stood. "Tell me." I felt the weight of the paper in my hand, heavier than it should have been. "If these protections were still recognized," I said, "the legal basis for what they're doing gets a lot weaker." Maya looked from me to Sienna. "Still recognized?" "That's the question," I said. "And if the answer is no, I want to know who made them disappear." The room went quiet around us, dust floating in the narrow beam from the overhead bulb. What we'd found wasn't just history. It was motive. Because protections like these don't vanish by accident. They get buried by someone who understands exactly how dangerous they are when they surface. By Friday morning, the attack stopped pretending to be patient. The notice arrived just after 10, hand-delivered in a rigid overnight envelope that looked too expensive for the kind of message inside it. Maya brought it into Sienna's office without speaking. She only set it on the desk and stepped back, like she already knew the paper itself carried a kind of damage. Sienna opened it standing up. I watched her eyes move across the first paragraph, then the second. Her face changed in stages. First confusion, then disbelief, then that flat stillness people get when the blow lands so hard their body goes quiet before their thoughts do. She handed it to me without a word. Emergency suspension of use in the rehearsal wing pending electrical hazard review. Immediate effect. I read it once, then again, slower. Same pattern. Different costume. Urgent language. Controlled timeline. Heavy pressure. Very little room to breathe before the weekend. Of course it was the rehearsal wing. That was where the scholarship showcase was scheduled. 2 days away, every family invited, donors expected, instructors already stretched, students practicing for something many of them had been building toward for months. Shut down that wing now, and you didn't just interrupt operations. You poisoned confidence. Parents would ask for refunds. Donors would get nervous. New enrollments would stall. One weekend could crack cash flow hard enough to make the next month impossible. Sienna sat down carefully, like she no longer trusted her knees. No, she said, but quietly, like she was saying it to herself, not to me. No, they can't do this now. They can file it now, I said. That doesn't mean it holds. Her laugh came out thin and wrong. You think parents care about the distinction? I didn't answer, because she was right. Maya closed the office door behind her. I can start calling people. Sienna put a hand over her mouth and looked toward the dark practice room window. If we cancel the showcase, we lose the donors who were coming. If we move it, half the parents will assume the school's already closing. If I say nothing, rumors do the work for them. The room felt too small all at once. Outside, somewhere down the hall, a piano student was running scales in another studio, steady and unaware. The ordinary sound made the moment worse. I pulled the notice closer and started tracing signatures, routing stamps, authorization language. Emergency filings always reveal themselves in the margins, not the headline. The mechanics. The electrical risk was supposedly triggered by an accelerated specialist review under the same modernization rider we'd already flagged. Same private inspection chain. Same authority loop. Same pressure architecture. But this time there was one additional signature block, and that was where the paper slipped. A side authorization code tied to a transfer readiness benchmark. Not public language. Internal language. I wrote the code down and started searching through the vendor and financing notes I'd been building all week. 10 minutes later, I found it buried inside a redevelopment memo summary attached to reserve restructuring. Performance incentive release upon pre-transfer clearance of designated tenant classes. I read it twice, then a third time. Gavin wasn't just chasing the deal. He was chasing a private payout. He'd promised delivery. Clear the arts tenants before the property transfer, hit the benchmark, collect the money. That was why every move felt rushed. Profit alone can wait. Personal incentives can't. Sienna was watching me now, reading my face the way she'd learned to do over these long nights. What is it? I looked up. This isn't only about redevelopment value. Her expression tightened. When has it ever been only that? I turned the screen toward her. He has a side agreement. If the arts tenants are cleared before transfer, he gets paid separately. For a second, she didn't react. Then she leaned back in her chair as if the answer itself had pushed her there. So my mother's school, the bookstore, the print shop, all of this is a line item to him, I said. Maya muttered something sharp under her breath and started pacing the narrow office. I should have stopped there. That was enough to know what kind of man Gavin was. Enough to understand the speed of the attack. But I made one more call anyway. Not to Gavin. To my own firm. I asked a question I already knew I shouldn't ask. Whether anyone on the investor side had raised internal concerns about tenant displacement exposure before the assignment came to me. The silence on the other end lasted too long. Then came the answer, careful and professional and morally worthless. There had been strategic sensitivity. Certain issues were considered commercially delicate. My role had been limited to defined risk review, not deal interference. In other words, they knew enough to be nervous, and decided nervous was still acceptable if the client billings stayed strong. When the call ended, I set my phone down very gently. Sienna studied me from across the desk. That look again. This one's different. She stood. Ryan. I met her eyes. My firm knew parts of this were dirty. The words hung there. Not illegal, not on paper, not yet. Just dirty enough that decent people should have stepped in and didn't. Sienna's face changed then, not into anger, but something worse. Recognition. Like the world had just confirmed one of her oldest suspicions. I stood up and gathered the notice, the timeline, the side agreement reference, the payment map. The room felt suddenly cleaner to me. Harder. Simpler. Until that moment, I had still been trying to help her and preserve what was left of my place inside the system that trained me. Find the truth, hand it off, stay technically intact. That option was gone now. What are you doing? Sienna asked. Choosing, I said. I spread the papers across her desk in a new order. Not defensive. Offensive. This doesn't get fixed by a slow complaint, I said. They're counting on panic, delay, and exhaustion. So we go faster in the right direction. Maya stopped pacing. Sienna didn't move. I tapped the emergency order. First front, injunction. We block the closure before the weekend damage becomes the real weapon. Then I tapped the financing chain. Second front, money. Not public pressure. Not yet. We hit the lender and the bond side with hidden liability and conflicted inspections. Financial institutions move when exposure threatens them. Sienna stared at me. And your firm? I held her gaze. I'm done trying to protect my career from this, I said. From now on, I'm protecting the evidence. The fear in her eyes didn't disappear. But for the first time since this started, it had somewhere to stand besides panic. I resigned at 7:40 the next morning. No speech. No negotiation. No attempt to leave a door cracked open in case I needed to come crawling back later. I sent a formal notice from my apartment, attached a short preservation memo covering the files I'd touched, and returned my access credentials before anyone could suspend them first and frame it as discipline. It wasn't dramatic. That was the point. If they pushed me out, they could say I'd gone unstable, personal, compromised. If I walked out on my own terms, I kept the one thing I still needed, independence. By 8:30 I was at the school. Rain had finally stopped, but the whole street still looked wet and metallic, the city holding on to the storm even after it was over. Inside, the front desk lights were on. Maya was fielding calls with a legal pad in front of her and the expression of someone who had stopped expecting the day to be fair. Sienna met me halfway down the hall. You did it, she said. I handed her a copy of my resignation letter. I did. She read the first lines, then looked up. That was fast. They would have tried to buy silence first and discredit me second. I tucked my laptop under one arm and kept walking toward her office. This way they only get the second option. She followed me in, shutting the door behind us. And now we make it harder to corner you. I spread the new paperwork across her desk. During the night, I'd built a formal package. Vendor chains, shell entities, reserve account anomalies, inspection overlaps, timeline conflicts, ownership links, and the side agreement incentive tied to tenant clearance before transfer. Nothing dramatic on the surface. Just the kind of orderly damage institutions fear most. Beside it sat a second set of documents for Sienna. What's this? She asked. A protected operating escrow structure, I said. You keep making rent and core payments through a controlled channel. That way they can't twist timing, routing, or partial holds into a default claim. Her eyes moved across the first page. You did this overnight? I didn't sleep. That wasn't a compliment. It wasn't meant to be. For the first time that morning, one corner of her mouth almost moved. Not a smile. Just recognition that I was still myself under the pressure. By 10, the package was out. Not to the press. Not to the city first. Not to anyone who would admire outrage and then take 2 weeks to schedule a meeting. I sent it to the property lender's legal risk division and the bond insurer's exposure desk, with narrow cover language and supporting exhibits attached. Hidden liability. Conflicted inspections. Undisclosed related party vendors. Potential impairment of protected tenancy obligations. Financial institutions don't respond to moral arguments. They respond to threats against their position. At 11:13, the first acknowledgement came in. At 11:42, the second. By noon, Gavin knew. We found out because the building stopped pretending everything was routine. Maya came to the office door without knocking. 3 men just got off the freight elevator, she said. Building security, plus one I haven't seen before. Sienna stood immediately. Where? Hallway by the front desk. I was already moving. The 3 of them were outside the school entrance when we reached the corridor. Dark jackets. Clipboards. One carrying a case of lock cylinders like he'd brought the ending with him. The one in front stepped forward. Per Emergency Operations Authority, this suite is being secured pending full hazard review. No, Sienna said. Not loudly, but with enough force that all three men paused. Parents were already nearby. A cello student with her father. Two instructors. A mother from the scholarship program still holding garment bags for the weekend showcase. The timing told me everything. Gavin wanted physical control before any court protection activated. Change the locks. Seize the space. Let us spend days clawing backward while the event collapsed on schedule. The man with the clipboard lifted a page. Ma'am, if you interfere. She won't, I said, stepping beside her. Because you're not getting that far. He glanced at me. And you are? I handed him the filed restraint notice. His eyes moved. Stopped. Went back up to mine. Temporary relief is pending service, I said. Lender review has also been triggered on your client's inspection chain and disclosure obligations. So unless you'd like to explain to them why you attempted a lockout during active challenge, I suggest you all step away from the door. Behind us, more people were gathering now. Maya had moved fast. Staff, parents, older students, Leon from the bookstore, even the print shop owner's son from the rear annex. Not shouting, not chaotic, just present, watching, filling the hallway until there was no private version of this left to stage. Sienna saw it too. For so much of this fight, she'd been reacting, absorbing, trying to keep panic from spilling into the rooms where children still needed lessons and teachers still needed answers. But now something in her settled into place. She stepped forward, shoulders square, voice clear. This school is open, she said. Any attempt to remove staff, students, or property will be documented and challenged. Everyone here is a witness. The hallway went still. The clipboard man looked at the people around us, then at the notice in his hand, then back toward the elevator as if hoping a better instruction might appear by itself. It didn't. A minute later his phone rang. He listened, said almost nothing, then ended the call with the tight expression of someone who had just been told to retreat without being given permission to admit defeat. This is not over, he said. No, I said. It isn't. They backed off. Not far. Just enough to stop the immediate play. As the elevator doors closed on them, the tension in the hallway broke into scattered voices, movement, questions. But Sienna didn't turn to the crowd first. She turned to me. You were right, she said quietly. About what? They only win when everything stays hidden. I looked past her at the school entrance, still open, still lit, still hers for the moment. Then we keep it visible. Her gaze held mine for a second longer than usual. Then Maya came back down the hall at a near run, phone in hand. There's a hearing date, she said. Early. Very early. Of course there was. Gavin had been forced to pull back in public, but men like him never mistake delay for surrender. He'd lost the hallway. Now he'd want the room where people wore suits, used careful words, and did damage with cleaner hands. He'd also know something else now. Sienna and I weren't just inconvenient anymore. We were dangerous. By the time the hearing date landed, the fight had outgrown the school. What started as one bad notice taped to one decent business had become a pattern with names, dates, signatures, and money attached to it. The difference now was that we could finally prove it. For 3 straight days, Sienna and I worked out of the office like we were building a machine designed to survive impact. No wasted motion. No loose paper. No assumptions left untested. I organized the case the only way I trusted. Timeline first, ownership second, payment chains third, procedural defects last. Facts had to arrive in the right order, or people with polished titles would pretend not to understand what they were seeing. Sienna handled the human side of the blast radius. Parents, instructors, donors, students, other tenants. She kept the school running while deciding whether she was willing to let this become bigger than her own lease. I could see the cost of that choice every time she paused at the office window before turning back to work. Saving her school was one kind of fight. Becoming the public face of a building-wide scheme was another. Maya brought in the piece that changed everything. She showed up carrying a flat archive box and set it on the desk like it might break if she moved too fast. Found these in the old admin storage, she said. I think someone meant for them to stay buried. Inside were renewal packet drafts from years back, marked by hand, with attached email printouts clipped behind them. I read the first one standing up, then the second. By the third, I sat down. Protected arts tenancy language had not faded out over time. It had been removed on purpose. The emails were dry, almost casual, which made them worse. Internal discussion. Revised packet language. Simplification for transition. Avoid legacy complications in new lease cycle. Strip the wording. Remove the obligation. Let the future paperwork pretend the promise had never existed. Sienna read over my shoulder in total silence. When she finished, she put both hands on the desk and stared at the page. They erased us, she said. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just exact. I looked at her. They tried. That same afternoon, a retired building administrator named Arthur Bell agreed to meet us in the recital room after Maya tracked him down through an old tenant contact list. He came in wearing a raincoat that had seen better years and carrying the careful posture of a man who had spent too long minding other people's property. He didn't waste time pretending he was there for nostalgia. I saw the lockout attempt, he said. Word travels when people still know each other. He sat across from us and studied the packet I'd assembled. Not surprised. Not impressed. Just grim. The arts tenants were always the easiest marks, he said. Book people. Print people. Teachers. Skilled, proud, overworked, and never capitalized well enough for a long legal war. That was the calculation. Sienna's jaw tightened. You knew? I knew the building had obligations that newer management found inconvenient. He tapped one of the old letters. These protections were part of the identity agreement when the property shifted hands years ago. Community use wasn't decoration. It was consideration. That word mattered. Consideration. Contract weight. Legal meaning. Arthur gave us a sworn statement before he left. Not emotional. Useful. The best kind. That night, after Maya went home and the last student left, Sienna stayed in the office with me while rain brushed softly against the front windows. The school was quiet again, that unnatural quiet I'd come to recognize as both fragile and stubborn. She stood by the filing cabinet, arms folded, looking at the stacks we'd built. If I keep this narrow, she said, I might save the school faster. I looked up from the hearing binder. Maybe. And if I widen it? You make yourself harder to isolate, I said, but easier to target. She nodded once, like she had already known that and only needed to hear it out loud. This place was my mother's life, she said. For weeks I've been thinking like a person trying not to lose one room. Her eyes shifted to the evidence map on the wall. But it was never one room. No, it wasn't. By the hearing morning, our case was no longer built around outrage. That was intentional. Outrage invites performance. Evidence invites fear. I walked in with binders tabbed by category: procedural defects, inspection conflicts, related party vendors, concealed incentive structures, legacy tenancy protections, settlement patterns, occupancy manipulation. Clean. Ordered. Difficult to dismiss without leaving fingerprints. Gavin was there with counsel, polished as ever, but something had changed. Men like him are at their strongest when everyone else is still guessing. He wasn't guessing anymore. He knew exactly what we had, and worse, he knew who else had seen it. I didn't make speeches. I answered questions. Dates. Filing windows. LLC ownership. Reserved disbursement paths. Altered packet language. Override clauses. Transfer benchmarks. The truth, when arranged correctly, has its own force. It doesn't need decoration. Then lender counsel asked for a recess. That was the first real crack. City council followed with questions about tenancy obligations and disclosure exposure. Gavin's side started narrowing arguments instead of expanding them. They stopped talking about safety with confidence. They started talking about process, review, interpretation, retreat language. Sienna was given the chance to frame the requested relief narrowly around the school. She didn't. She stood, steady as I'd ever seen her, and said the issue was larger than her business and had been from the start. That community tenants had been pressured through different pretexts toward the same result. That any remedy worth granting had to account for the pattern, not just the loudest current target. That was the moment she stopped being a cornered tenant. That was the moment she became a force in the room. By late afternoon, emergency protections were granted. Redevelopment activity tied to the disputed enforcement chain was frozen pending broader review. The attempted removals, the inspection structure, the tenancy record issues, all of it was now under scrutiny powerful enough to hurt the people who had counted on silence. Outside the hearing room, the hallway felt strangely still. Not victorious. Not yet. Just open. Sienna turned to me, exhausted and bright-eyed in the same impossible way. So this is the part where you tell me we won. I looked at the papers in my hand, then back at her. No, I said. This is the part where you decide what to build now that they failed to erase it. The sale stopped 3 days later. Not slowed. Not questioned. Stopped. Once the lender's review widened and the bond side started asking for every disclosure trail connected to the inspection chain, Gavin's backers did what backers always do when risk stops looking profitable. They stepped away from him before they admitted they'd ever trusted him. His side agreement vanished into legal review. His authority vanished faster. By the end of the week, he was out. No clean announcement, no dramatic apology, just a carefully worded separation that told everyone exactly what it was trying not to say. The building, meanwhile, was too exposed to continue as if nothing had happened. The lender imposed restructuring conditions across the entire property. Lease records had to be reviewed. Enforcement procedures had to be rebuilt. Historical occupancy obligations had to be examined instead of buried. For the first time in years, the people who actually lived their working lives inside those walls were in the room when decisions were discussed. And that was where the future changed. At first, everyone assumed the best possible outcome was restoration. Put things back. Rewind the damage. Return to the old arrangement and hope the next polished man with a title stayed busy somewhere else. But restoration started to feel too small. The bookstore, the print shop, the costume studio, the school, none of them wanted to survive one attack only to stand separately for the next one. So when the Lenders Restructuring Council floated a long-term governance option for the arts occupants, Sienna was the first person at the table who understood what it could become. Not just protected leases, protected structure. A cooperative operating council with long-term tenancy rights, shared review authority over building use changes, and written recognition that the arts occupants were not decorative leftovers in a redevelopment story. They were part of the building's actual identity. I watched Sienna take hold of that idea the way some people take hold of music, first by instinct, then by discipline, then by total commitment. A month earlier, she had been trying to keep one school from being pushed out quietly. Now she was in meetings with lawyers, tenants, and lenders, redrafting the future of the whole property with the same calm foresight first seen only in flashes. She wasn't protecting inherited ground anymore. She was redefining it. The delayed scholarship showcase happened 2 weeks later. Same hall, same stage, same old fear, at least in me, that something would still go wrong at the last minute because I had gotten too used to expecting the next blow. But nothing did. The lights came up on time. Parents filled the seats. Donors showed. Teachers moved through the aisles with clipboards and coffee, and that particular backstage focus that means chaos has been negotiated into order. The building felt different that night. Not safer, exactly. Safer is a temporary word. This felt reclaimed. I stood near the back before it started, not in a suit this time, not carrying binders, not answering calls from people who measured truth against client value. I had spent the previous 10 days filing the paperwork for my own practice. Small, independent, forensic advisory work for institutions too easy to corner and too underfunded to defend themselves against polished fraud. It wasn't the career path I'd planned, which probably meant it was the first honest one I'd chosen in years. Sienna found me just before the first students went on. She was wearing black, simple and sharp, with a folder tucked under one arm, and that look she got now when 10 things were moving at once, and somehow none of them were moving without her. The old panic was gone. In its place was something steadier. Not ease. Authority. You're hiding in the back, she said. I'm observing. That's a cleaner word for hiding. I like clean words. She stopped in front of me, close enough that I could catch the faint scent of paper, coffee, and the citrus soap from the staff restroom she always seemed to smell like after long days. Familiar now. Distractingly familiar. Arthur's here, she said. Leon too. The print shop family brought flowers for Maya. The costume studio is doing repairs for the winter recital wardrobe. Her voice softened just a little. You should see what this place sounds like when people stop waiting for it to disappear. I already do. Her eyes held mine for a second, and in that second I felt the whole shape of what had happened to us. No sudden confession. No reckless leap. Nothing borrowed from panic or relief. Just the accumulated weight of every hour she'd watched me refuse the easy exit, and every hour I'd watched her stand back up under pressure that would have flattened most people. I was wrong about you, she said. You've said that without saying it for a while. I know. One corner of her mouth moved. I hated you in the lobby. I remember. I think, she said, I only trusted you when it became expensive. That made me smile before I could stop it. That's fair. From the stage, a piano note sounded. Then another. The audience settled. Sienna looked toward the hall, then back at me. I don't need rescuing, Ryan. I know. I know you know. She took a breath. That's why this works. There it was. Not dramatic. Not uncertain. Just true. I reached for her hand because anything else would have felt less honest than the silence between us had already been. She let me take it. No hesitation. The first ensemble began to play, and the sound carried through the restored hall, warm and full and stubbornly alive. Students who had spent weeks hearing adults whisper about closures and notices and hearings now played like none of those people had managed to shrink the room at all. Sienna stood beside me, watching the stage with her hand in mine. Not cornered, not afraid, not waiting for permission. And I understood, standing there in the place they had nearly turned into another empty transaction, that this was the real ending to the fight. Not that Gavin lost, or that the sale collapsed, or that the paperwork finally told the truth. It was this: the school still open, the hall still full, the building no longer a trap, but a place reclaimed by the people who had refused to let money define its worth. Sienna squeezed my hand once, eyes still on the stage. I squeezed back. What came next for us would not be easy, and neither of us was built to pretend otherwise. But easy had never been the standard. Chosen was. And for the first time in a long time, the future in front of me looked less like a risk calculation